that the United States is officially withdrawing from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. Perhaps we can negotiate a different agreement, adding China and others, or perhaps we can't, in which case we will outspend and out-innovate all others by far. To ensure this corrupt dictatorship never acquires nuclear weapons, I withdrew the United States from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. If I had not been elected President of the United States, we would right now, in my opinion, be in a major war with North Korea. Chairman Kim and I will meet again on February 27th and 28th in Vietnam. We stand with the Venezuelan people in their noble quest for freedom, and we condemn the brutality of the Maduro regime. Great nations do not fight endless wars. As we work with our allies to destroy the remnants of ISIS, it is time to give our brave warriors in Syria a warm welcome home. In Afghanistan, my administration is holding constructive talks with a number of Afghan groups, including the Taliban. After 2 decades of war, the hour has come to at least try for peace.
Okay, some highlights there of the foreign policy issues the president discussed in his State of the Union address.
You heard the president speak about canceling a Cold War-era treaty with Russia. Then he seemed to raise the possibility of an arms race. He also discussed Iran, Afghanistan, ISIS, Venezuela, and announced the time and place for the next summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un.
A lot of stuff there for foreign policy watchers. Joining us now live is Bloomberg opinion editor and columnist Bobby Ghosh. Bobby, what struck you the most?
Well, the only real piece of news there was the dates for his meeting with Chairman Kim, February 27th and 28th in Vietnam. Everything else is a sort of rehash of what we heard before. I was expecting to hear more about Venezuela because of the proximity, not just of the country itself to the United States, but the fact that there's a big crisis right now. So I did expect Venezuela to feature more prominently and some sort of sense of what he was going to do about it. We didn't hear that. There was a sort of quite general thing. We stand with the people of Venezuela. That's sort of bromide. Any politician would say that. There was no effort for a sort of larger meta-narrative about America's place in the world. What is America's role? I mean, we're withdrawing from some places. We want to engage in some other places. What is his overall foreign policy? Not much clarity on that. But to be perfectly honest, I wasn't expecting a great deal of clarity. It is a very muddled policy. It has been for the last 2 years. So why should we expect a break in the clouds right now?
Any foreign policy issue that he did not address that you expected he would or he should have, one that would come to mind possibly, Israeli-Palestinian peace plan?
Well, clearly that's something that's in the back burner now. No discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian peace plan. No discussion. The word Europe, I don't think even escaped his lips. There was no discussion about Saudi Arabia, which has been front and center of a lot of controversy for the past several months. No talk of Saudi Arabia there. It is a big world, and the United States is exposed to a large part of it. So it's perhaps unreasonable to expect him to cover all of that, the seafront. But certainly, I was surprised that Israel-Palestine didn't come up in Europe a little more.
All right, you mentioned the thing that was news was the date of his second meeting, another summit with Kim Jong-un at the end of the month in Vietnam. The president seems to be a little at odds with his intelligence community about the success in Vietnam versus the danger of Iran. What do you think comes of this Korea summit, North Korea summit? Is it real stuff, or is this something the president has started to enjoy as pageantry?
Well, this won't work as pageantry again. The first time he did it, nothing real came off it, but he could make the argument that, look, this is a historic occasion, an American president, a North Korean leader, meeting, shaking hands, posing for photographs. That was enough. That was a result in and of itself. You can't do that a second time. You can't. The second time around, you need something more concrete. So if he comes back from Vietnam with nothing more than some more photographs and talk of how they love each other, that's not going to suffice. He's going to actually need the North Koreans to show that they are actually at least scaling way back and ideally beginning to dismantle their nuclear program.
Well, he would make
the
the
South
argument.
Koreans have welcomed. Beg your pardon. Go ahead.
He would make the argument, or Mike Pompeo would, that at the very least these summits are a start. They're getting to the table, and we're not seeing the testing happening.
Well, the North Koreans are playing this administration like a fiddle. They're aiming for they're asking for the big summits because it suits Chairman Kim to meet the president and pose for those photographs. But every time, as we know, when summits like this happens, the real work gets done by people lower down the pecking order. Every time Pompeo tries to go there and get some actual concrete things on paper, some things done, he gets rebuffed. Every time any other U.S. official goes, they don't even get to meet the right people in Pyongyang. So the North Koreans are happy for this to be sort of stage managed, big ticket once a year or a couple of times a year, sort of glad handling between Kim and the president, but nothing of any real substance is being done. So after a while, it gets a little tiresome to keep hearing the administration say it's a start. Well, the start happened. Now what? What after the start? When do you go to second gear or third?
The comment after the discussion about getting out of the intermediate nuclear range treaty last week, the president seemed to hint at an arms race. The Russians have always said they want out of this treaty because the Chinese are developing techniques that they don't have access to because of the treaty. There are a number of people in the world worried right now that we might see ourselves now getting into a three-way arms race with China.
Yes, and the president, given his age, and is a child of the Cold War, and perhaps thinks in those terms. But this is not the 50s, 60s, and 70s anymore. The world has changed dramatically. The United States, Russia, China, the three economies are very tightly meshed with each other. The United States is no longer in the position that it used to be, where you could throw tens of billions of dollars into the development of these kinds of weapons programs. A country with an enormous deficit, enormous spending in military already, needs to be more careful about these sort of things. I think, during the Reagan years, much was made of the fact that the United States, by ratcheting up nuclear and other defense spending, was able to bankrupt the Soviet Union essentially and force the end of the Cold War. That period is over. It doesn't work like that anymore. And the Chinese, who can do this a lot cheaper than the U.S. can, have a big advantage.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.